In the quiet hours, when the world settles into darkness, and our minds begin to wander through the corridors of memory and dream, there exists a realm where love stories unfold, not with gentle embraces and whispered promises, but with the weight of eternal consequence and the sharp edge of divine intervention. These are the love stories of ancient Greece, where passion burns bright enough to illuminate the underworld itself, yet casts shadows so deep that mortals and gods alike lose themselves in their darkness. What is it about love that makes it both the most beautiful and most terrible force in existence? Why do the myths of our ancestors speak of romance not as gentle spring rain, but as lightning that splits the sky and leaves the earth forever changed? Perhaps it is because they understood something we have forgotten in our modern world, something about the true nature of desire and devotion, about how love, when it reaches its deepest depths, becomes indistinguishable from obsession, from madness, from the very forces that shape life and death themselves. If you find yourself drawn to these ancient whispers, these tales that have echoed through millennia, then settle in for a journey through the shadows of the heart. Let the gentle rhythm of these stories carry you into a realm where love is never simple, never safe, never quite what it appears to be on the surface. The Greeks understood that love stories worth telling are not those that end with happiness ever after, but those that reveal the fundamental truths about what it means to be human, to yearn, to lose, and to discover that sometimes the most profound love is also the most destructive. In their mythology, love becomes a force as primal and dangerous as the sea itself, capable of creating new worlds or drowning everything in its path. Tonight, we descend into 9 tales that explore love in all its terrible beauty, each one a meditation on different aspects of desire and devotion. We will walk beside gods who discover that divine power cannot shield them from heartbreak, mortals who love so deeply they challenge death itself, and those caught between the mortal and divine realms, who learn that some boundaries should never be crossed. These stories unfold like dark flowers blooming in moonlight, beautiful and haunting, revealing truths that daylight reasoning cannot touch. They speak to something ancient within us, something that recognizes the landscapes of the heart even when they are painted in shadows and starlight. So close your eyes, let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to be carried into a world where love and tragedy dance together in an eternal embrace, where every kiss carries the taste of both honey and poison, and where the line between devotion and destruction grows thin as spider silk in the darkness. The first whisper comes from the deepest realm of all, from the kingdom where light never reaches, and where a god who had known only solitude learned that love could bloom, even in the darkness of death itself. It begins with the sound of footsteps on earth that would soon crack open, revealing the depths below, and a young maiden whose laughter would echo through the underworld for all eternity. In the time when the world was younger and the boundaries between realms were as thin as morning mist, there ruled beneath the earth a god whose name was spoken only in whispers, whose kingdom stretched beyond the reach of sunlight into caverns that held the secrets of every soul that had ever drawn breath. Hades, lord of the dead, master of riches, both material and spiritual, dwelt in a palace carved from obsidian and adorned with gems that captured what little light filtered down from the world above. For countless ages, Hades had ruled his domain with neither companion nor confidant, surrounded by the endless procession of souls that came to his realm but never truly belonged to it. The dead were his subjects, but they were not his people. The shadows were his servants, but they offered no warmth. Even the precious metals and stones that gave him his wealth felt cold beneath his touch. Beautiful but lifeless, much like his existence had become. Yet above, in the realm of light and growing things, there lived a goddess whose very presence could coax flowers from barren soil, and whose laughter could bring early spring to the coldest winter day. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, mother of abundance, had a daughter who embodied everything her mother represented, and more. Persephone moved through the world like living springtime, her footsteps leaving trails of new grass. Her breath warm enough to wake sleeping seeds, her smile bright enough to rival the sun itself. Persephone knew nothing of the darkness below, nothing of the lonely god who had begun to venture closer and closer to the surface world, drawn by stories whispered by the dead about a maiden whose beauty could make the earth itself jealous. She spent her days in meadows that seemed to exist purely for her enjoyment, surrounded by companions who loved her, not for her divine nature, but for her genuine warmth, her curiosity about the world, her ability to find wonder in the smallest flower or the most ordinary butterfly. It was in one such meadow, on a day when the air shimmered with the promise of eternal spring, that the earth beneath Persephone's feet began to tremble. She had been reaching for a narcissus flower that seemed to glow with its own inner light, its petals more perfect than any flower she had ever seen. Her fingers had just brushed its stem when the ground split open with a sound like thunder, and from the chasm that appeared rose a chariot pulled by horses, whose coats were the color of midnight and whose eyes burned like distant stars. The figure holding the reins was tall and imposing, wrapped in robes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, his face bearing the pale, austere beauty of marble statues, his eyes holding depths that spoke of centuries spent in contemplation of matters beyond mortal understanding. This was Hades, and in the moment his gaze fell upon Persephone, something in his carefully ordered world shifted irrevocably. Later, poets would call it love at first sight, but perhaps it was something more complicated than that. Perhaps it was the recognition of two halves of creation meeting for the first time. The Lord of Endings encountering the Lady of Beginnings, the master of what was dead, discovering the embodiment of what could live forever. Or perhaps it was simply that Hades, who had spent so long surrounded by what was finished, was overwhelmed by the sight of someone who represented infinite possibility. Whatever force moved through him in that moment, it was strong enough to make him act without thought, without consideration for anything but the desperate need to not let this vision of life and light disappear from his existence. Before Persephone could step back, before she could call out to her companions, before she could even fully process what was happening, strong arms encircled her and lifted her into the chariot. The horses needed no urging to plunge back into the earth, carrying their master and his prize down through layers of soil and stones, through caverns that grew progressively darker and more silent until they emerged into the vast halls of the underworld. The journey that took only moments in the telling seemed to last hours in the living, each second stretching like a year as Persephone watched the circle of sunlight above grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. When the chariot finally came to rest in the courtyard of Hades' palace, Persephone found herself in a place that defied every expectation she might have had about the realm of the dead. The palace was indeed dark, but it was the rich darkness of deep night skies, studded with stars, not the oppressive darkness of a tomb. Rivers of silver ran through gardens where flowers bloomed that were more beautiful than any that grew in the upper world, though they gave off no fragrance and made no sound when the wind touched them. Everything here existed in a strange twilight state, beautiful but removed from the vital force that animated the world above. It was a realm of echoes and shadows, of beauty preserved but not living, of riches that could be accumulated but never truly enjoyed. And in the center of it all stood Hades, now uncertain and almost vulnerable in a way that seemed impossible for one of his power. He did not, as one might expect from the stories told about gods and their appetites, attempt to force his will upon his captive. Instead, he seemed almost lost, as if having achieved his heart's desire, he now had no idea what to do with it. He offered Persephone chambers more beautiful than any palace in the upper world, servants to attend her every need, gardens where she could walk in solitude, libraries containing all the wisdom of the ages. What he could not offer was the one thing she wanted most, the freedom to return to the world of sunlight and growing things, to her mother, who must even now be searching for her, to the life she had been living before the earth opened and swallowed her whole. Days passed in the underworld, though day and night had no meaning in a realm where time moved differently than it did above. Persephone remained courteous but distant, accepting Hades' gifts but not his presence, taking shelter in his palace but refusing to make it her home. She ate nothing, drank only water, and spent long hours staring upward as if she could see through the earth to the sky she missed. Hades, for his part, seemed to grow more desperate with each passing day. He had stolen her body from the upper world, but her spirit remained as far from him as it had been when she walked in meadows he could only dream of. He began to speak to her of his realm, trying to show her its hidden beauties, its secret wonders. He told her of the rivers that could wash away memory or grant prophetic visions, of the fields where heroes dwelt in eternal peace, of the gardens where grew the flowers that bloomed only in starlight. Slowly, perhaps despite herself, Persephone began to listen. There was something in Hades' voice when he spoke of his kingdom that revealed not the coldness she had expected, but a deep loneliness, a hunger for connection that had nothing to do with desire, and everything to do with the simple human need to share one S-world with another consciousness that could appreciate its beauty. Meanwhile, in the world above, the seasons themselves began to mourn Persephone's absence. Demeter, discovering her daughter missing, had let loose such grief that no seed would sprout, no flower would bloom, no fruit would ripen. The earth, responding to the anguish of its goddess, began to wither and die. What had been the endless spring of Persephone's youth transformed into a winter more harsh and unforgiving than any the world had ever known. Mortals cried out to the gods for relief, but Demeter would not be consoled. She wandered the earth in the guise of an old woman, searching every corner of the world for her daughter, her grief so profound that wherever she walked, the very ground seemed to echo with loss. She questioned every nymph, every river god, every spirit of grove and glade, but no one could tell her what had become of Persephone. It was only when Helios, the sun god, who sees all that happens beneath his light, finally took pity on her suffering that the truth was revealed. He told her of the dark chariot that had emerged from the earth, of the figure who had taken her daughter into the depths of the realm where no sunlight ever penetrated, and from which no living soul had ever returned. Demeter's grief then transformed into something far more dangerous, a rage that threatened to tear the very fabric of creation itself. She confronted Zeus, king of the gods, demanding that he command his brother to return Persephone to the upper world. But Zeus found himself caught between the unstoppable force of Demeter's fury and the immovable object of his brother's newfound love, knowing that to satisfy one would be to destroy the other. As the debate raged among the gods, in the underworld itself, a different kind of understanding was beginning to grow between the Lord of the Dead and his captive queen. Persephone had begun to see past Hades' austere exterior to the loneliness that drove him, while he had begun to understand that true love could not be built on force, no matter how desperately desired. Their conversations, which had begun as formal exchanges between captor and captive, gradually became something deeper. Hades spoke of the weight of ruling a realm where every arrival was a tragedy, where his subjects came to him not in joy but in sorrow, where his very presence was associated with endings rather than beginnings. Persephone listened, and in listening began to understand the profound isolation of his existence. She told him of the upper world, of the joy she felt in coaxing new life from the earth, of the satisfaction of watching something grow from seed to flower to fruit. But as she spoke, she began to realize that there was something missing from her descriptions, some depth that the constant brightness of the upper world could never provide. Here, in the realm of endings, she was discovering truths about existence that could only be learned in the presence of mortality, of finitude, of the knowledge that all beautiful things must eventually pass away. It was during one of these conversations, as they walked through a garden where silver roses bloomed under a sky that held no sun, that Hades made an offer that surprised them both. He would release her, he said, if that was truly what she wanted. He would send her back to the upper world, to her mother's arms, to the meadows where she belonged. But he asked only that she considered whether she might find it possible to return, not as his captive, but as his willing queen. The offer hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Persephone felt the pull of the upper world, the longing for her mother's embrace, for sunlight on her face, for the simple joy of watching things grow. But she also felt something else, something she had not expected to discover in this realm of shadows, a sense of purpose that went beyond her own. Happiness, a recognition that she had found someone who needed her, not just as an object of desire, but as a partner in the profound work of ruling over the deepest mysteries of existence. Before she could give her answer, the very foundations of the underworld shook with the force of Zeus' command. The king of the gods had arrived, accompanied by Hermes, the messenger, who alone, among the Olympians, could travel freely between all realms. Zeus bore news that could not be ignored. The upper world was dying in Demeter's grief, and if Persephone was not returned, all life would cease to exist. But as Hermes prepared to escort Persephone back to the surface, Hades made one final, desperate gesture. He offered her food from his realm, pomegranate seeds that glowed like rubies in the eternal twilight of his kingdom. Whether this was a trick designed to bind her to the underworld, or a genuine desire to share something of his world with her, neither of them would ever be certain. Persephone, looking into his eyes, saw not calculation, but a kind of naked hope that was almost painful to witness. She had come to understand that this gift was not an attempt to trap her, but an invitation to choose her own fate, to decide for herself whether she would be bound to this realm by law or by love. She took the seeds, 6 of them, and ate them slowly, feeling their strange sweetness dissolve on her tongue, feeling something in her essence respond to them as if recognizing a part of itself. In that moment, she bound herself to the underworld, not as a prisoner, but as someone who had chosen to accept responsibility for its mysteries. The solution that emerged from this act was both elegant and tragic. Persephone would spend 6 months of each year in the underworld as Hades' queen, ruling beside him over the realm of the dead, helping to ease the transition of souls from life to whatever came after. The remaining 6 months she would spend in the upper world with her mother, bringing spring and summer back to the earth, coaxing new life from soil that had learned to trust in renewal. Thus were the seasons born from a love story that began with abduction and ended with choice, with compromise, with the recognition that some relationships can only exist in the space between two worlds. Persephone became the first being to truly belong to both life and death, to understand that endings and beginnings are not opposites but partners in the great dance of existence. When she emerged from the underworld for the first time as its queen rather than its captive, she brought with her a depth and wisdom that had not been there before. Her springtime was now more precious because it was not eternal. Her flowers more beautiful because she knew intimately the darkness from which they emerged. And when autumn came and she prepared to return to her husband's realm, she went not with sorrow, but with anticipation, knowing that she had found in that place of endings a love that transcended the simple categories of light and dark, life and death. Demeter, seeing her daughter transformed but not diminished, learned to accept the rhythm that had been established. Her grief at each parting became the dormancy of winter, her joy at each reunion the explosion of spring growth. The world learned to live with cycles, with the understanding that some absences make the returns more meaningful, that some loves can only exist in the tension between presence and absence. In the underworld, Hades discovered that ruling beside someone who chose to be there transformed the very nature of his realm. The dead began to arrive not just to judgment, but to genuine rest, sensing that their new queen understood both what they had lost and what they might still find in the world beyond life. The palace filled with a different kind of light, not the harsh brightness of the sun, but the gentle glow of understanding, of acceptance, of love that had learned to exist in the spaces between certainty and doubt. Yet even as this tale seems to end with balance achieved and love triumphant, it carries within it the seeds of all the darker stories that follow. For what is the price of choosing love over freedom, of accepting that some relationships can only exist through compromise and sacrifice? What happens when the very foundations of that choice begin to shift, when what seemed like willing partnership begins to feel like beautiful prison? These questions echo forward through time, reverberating in the story of another musician, another lover, who would venture into the same dark realm, not to rule, but to reclaim what death had stolen, whose tale of devotion would end not with compromise, but with the kind of loss that changes the very nature of music itself. In those days when the world still remembered how to listen to the language of music as more than mere entertainment, when songs could heal wounds and melodies could open doors between worlds, there lived a man whose voice could make the stones weep and whose lyre could convince Ipsa the trees to uproot themselves and dance. Orpheus was his name, and those who heard him play spoke afterward of having glimpsed something beyond the ordinary world, some realm where beauty existed in its purest form, untainted by the compromises and limitations that bound all earthly things. He was not merely a musician, but a poet whose words could reshape reality, a wanderer who had traveled to the edges of the known world and returned with songs that spoke of mysteries no other mortal had witnessed. When he sang of the birth of the cosmos, listeners could see the stars forming in the darkness. When he sang of love, the most hardened hearts softened like wax in sunlight. When he sang of loss, even those who had never known sorrow found themselves weeping for griefs they could not name. It was perhaps inevitable that such a man would find love, and equally inevitable that the love he found would be extraordinary in its depth and intensity. Her name was Eurydice, and she was herself a creature of music and movement, a nymph whose dancing could bring rain to drought-stricken lands, and whose laughter had the power to heal both body and spirit. When they came together, it was as if the universe itself exhaled in satisfaction, recognizing the rightness of their union. Their courtship was conducted in the language of melody and rhythm, with songs that seemed to spring spontaneously from the earth itself whenever they were together. Orpheus would play, and Eurydice would dance, and in the space between his music and her movement, something magical would come to life that was greater than either of them alone. The very air around them would shimmer with possibility, and those fortunate enough to witness their joy spoke afterward of having seen what love looked like when it existed without fear, without reservation, without the shadow of mortality to dim its brightness. They married in a ceremony that lasted 3 days and 3 nights, with music that never paused and dancing that flowed like water from one form to another. The gods themselves were said to have attended, not as dignified observers, but as participants in the celebration, caught up in the sheer exuberance of a love that seemed to promise that all the beautiful things in the world might indeed last forever. For a time, it seemed that this promise might be fulfilled. Orpheus and Eurydice lived in a manner that suggested that happiness was not a fleeting state, but a permanent condition, something that could be cultivated and maintained through the simple practice of loving completely and without reservation. Their home was always filled with music, their days structured around the rhythms of creation and joy, their nights spent in conversations that seemed to weave new worlds from words and silences. But in a universe where balance must be maintained, where every light casts a shadow, and every joy carries within it the seed of its own ending, such perfect happiness could not exist without attracting the attention of forces that exist to remind mortals of their limitations. It came when it came, not as a dramatic catastrophe, but as the kind of simple accident that demonstrates how fragile even the most beautiful lives can be. Eurydice had been walking through a meadow, gathering flowers for a crown. She planned to weave for her husband's birthday, her feet bare and her dress trailing through grass that seemed to bend toward her as if seeking her blessing. She was thinking of the song Orpheus had played for her that morning, a melody so beautiful that it had made her weep with happiness. When her foot found the one patch of ground in all that meadow where danger lay hidden, the snake that bit her was no mythical monster, no creature sent by jealous gods to punish mortals for their presumption. It was simply a serpent going about its serpent business, as startled by the encounter as she was, striking out in fear and confusion at the foot that had disturbed its rest. In any other story, it might have been the beginning of a quest to find a cure, an adventure that would test the hero's resolve and ultimately reward his devotion with his beloved's recovery. But this was not that kind of story. The venom that coursed through Eurydice's veins was not the kind that could be neutralized by heroic effort or divine intervention. It was simply death, arriving not with drama or meaning, but with the casual indifference that marks all real endings. She had time for only a few words, a few final touches of her husband's face, a few last notes of the song. They had been composing together before the light went out of her eyes, and her body became nothing more than a beautiful shell from which everything that had made her herself had departed. Orpheus, arriving moments too late to save her, found himself confronting a reality for which none of his music had prepared him. Death, he discovered, was not a dramatic force to be challenged or reasoned with, but a simple absence, a subtraction that left the world smaller and emptier but otherwise unchanged. The sun continued to shine, the birds continued to sing, the flowers continued to bloom, as if the universe had not just lost one of its most beautiful voices. For days, he sat beside her body, playing laments that seemed to draw their power from some deep well of anguish that he had never known existed within him. His music, which had always been a force of creation and joy, transformed into something darker and more powerful songs that spoke to the fundamental injustice of mortality, melodies that seemed to argue with the very structure of reality itself. The trees that had once danced to his playing now bent low, as if in mourning. The stones wept actual tears. Rivers changed their courses to avoid passing near the place where such profound grief was being expressed. Even the gods in their distant palaces felt the pull of his sorrow and found themselves pausing in their eternal games to listen to music that reminded them of things they had forgotten about, the cost of caring too deeply. But grief, no matter how profound, cannot resurrect the dead, and music, no matter how beautiful, cannot undo what has been done. Orpheus was forced to acknowledge that all his art, all his power over the natural world, all his favor with the gods, was ultimately powerless against the simple fact of ending. It was then that he made the decision that would transform his personal tragedy into the stuff of legend. If death would not release its hold on Eurydice, then he would go to death's own realm and demand her return. The journey to the underworld was not, for Orpheus, the same kind of adventure it would have been for a hero armed with sword and shield. His weapons were his lyre and his voice. His armor was his determination. His map was the trail of his own grief leading downward, through caverns that grew progressively darker and more silent as he descended toward the realm where no living voice had ever been heard. The three-headed dog Cerberus, whose bite could tear apart the souls of the dead, lay down at Orpheus's feet and whimpered like a puppy. The ferryman Charon, who had never, in all the ages of his service, carried a living passenger across the river of death, found himself rowing without conscious decision, his ancient arms moving in rhythm with melodies that spoke of loves so profound they transcended the boundary between life and death. As Orpheus descended deeper into the realm of shadows, his music began to work changes that no power had ever before achieved in that place of endings. The tortured souls who suffered eternal punishments found their agonies temporarily suspended as his melodies washed over them. The judges of the dead paused in their deliberations, their stern faces softening as they remembered what it felt like to hope. Even the rivers that were supposed to wash away memory found their waters growing clear, reflecting for the first time in eons the faces of those who looked into them. When at last he stood before the thrones of Hades and Persephone, Orpheus played the song he had been composing during his entire journey downward, a piece of music that contained all his love for Eurydice, all his anguish at her loss, all his desperate hope that death might prove not to be the final word in their story. He sang of the life they had shared, the joy they had created together, the future that had been stolen from them by nothing more meaningful than an accident of timing and place. Hades, who had ruled over the realm of endings for so long that he had forgotten what beginnings felt like, found himself moved in ways he had not experienced since Persephone had first brought the possibility of love into his dark kingdom. Here was a mortal whose devotion rivaled his own, whose willingness to challenge the natural order echoed his own decision to steal a goddess from the upper world. In Orpheus's plea, he heard the echo of his own desperate need for connection, his own refusal to accept that love and death must be enemies. She remembered her own tears during her first separation from her mother, her own desperate hope that some compromise might be found that would allow love to triumph over the demands of cosmic law. Together, the rulers of the dead made a decision that had never been made before in the history of their realm. They would allow Eurydice to return to the world of the living. Orpheus could lead Eurydice back to the upper world, but he could not look upon her face during the journey. He must walk ahead of her, trusting that she followed, believing in her presence without the confirmation of his senses. Only when they both stood once again in sunlight could he turn and embrace the wife who had been returned to him from the very jaws of death. The condition seemed simple enough, a small price to pay for a miracle that violated everything anyone had ever believed about the finality of death. Orpheus accepted it eagerly, his heart already racing with anticipation of the moment when he would once again hold Eurydice in his arms, when her voice would once again harmonize with his, when their life together could resume as if it had never been interrupted. The journey back toward the surface began with a joy so profound that it seemed to transform the very air around them. Behind him, Orpheus could hear the soft whisper of footsteps that meant Eurydice was following, could sense her presence like a warm light at his back, could almost feel her breath on his neck as they climbed together toward the world they had shared. His music, as they traveled, became something entirely new, a celebration that seemed to announce to all the worlds that love had indeed proven stronger than death. The footsteps behind him seemed sometimes to falter, sometimes to fade altogether before resuming. The sense of her presence that had been so strong at the beginning of their journey began to waver, leaving him. Moments of terrifying uncertainty about whether she was truly there, or whether he was climbing alone, deluded by his own desperate hope. What if the gods had tricked him? What if he reached the surface only to discover that he had been following his own echo, his own shadow, his own desperate need to believe that love could conquer death? The questions multiplied as they climbed, each one making the next step more difficult, each doubt making the simple act of not looking back into an almost unbearable test of faith. The light ahead grew stronger, and with it grew Orpheus's certainty that something was wrong. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled only with the echo of his own movement and the terrible possibility that he was indeed alone. When the entrance to the upper world finally came into view, when he could see actual sunlight streaming down through the opening, he could continue forward, trusting in what he could not see, maintaining faith in a promise that might or might not be real. Or he could turn, just once, just for a moment, and confirm with his own eyes that the miracle he had been granted was genuine. Love, it turned out, was not strong enough to overcome the simple human need for certainty. At the very threshold of the upper world, with sunlight only steps away, Orpheus turned to look upon the face of his beloved wife, to assure himself that she was truly there, truly restored, truly his once again. She was there, beautiful and alive, and smiling at him with all the love that had drawn him into the depths of the earth to reclaim her. But even as their eyes met, even as her lips formed his name, the magic that had sustained her presence began to unravel. The condition had been broken, the trust had been violated, and the laws of death, which had been bent but not broken, reasserted themselves with all the finality that had been temporarily suspended. Eurydice faded like morning mist touched by sunlight, her form growing translucent, and then transparent, and then simply absent, leaving behind only the echo of her voice saying his name and the terrible knowledge that he had held a miracle in his hands, and let it slip away because he could not bring himself to believe in what he could not see. Orpheus emerged from the underworld alone, carrying with him not the wife he had gone to reclaim, but the weight of a loss that was somehow even more devastating than the original tragedy, at least when Eurydice had died from the serpent's bite. But this second loss was entirely his own doing, the result of his failure to maintain faith at the crucial moment, his inability to love strongly enough to overcome his own doubt. The music that emerged from this experience was unlike anything the world had ever heard before. Songs of such profound anguish that they seemed to tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. Trees that heard him play withered and died. Rivers ran backward. The very stones of the earth cracked open, as if they could not bear the weight of such perfect despair. Orpheus wandered the world like a living ghost, his music a constant lament, not just for what he had lost, but for what he had thrown away. Not just for Eurydice's death, but for his own failure to prove worthy of the miracle he had been granted. He sang to empty theaters and silent forests, his voice growing more powerful and more terrible with each passing season, until even the gods began to fear what his grief might accomplish if left unchecked. In the end, it was other mortals who brought his story to its close, women driven to madness by music that reminded them too painfully of their own losses, their own failures, their own moments when love had not been strong enough to overcome fear. They tore him apart in a frenzy of collective anguish, scattering his body across the landscape, but leaving his head and lyre to float down the river, still singing songs of loss and longing that would echo through the world long after the man who created them. The lesson of Orpheus and Eurydice echoes forward through all the love stories that follow, a reminder that sometimes the greatest tragedies arise not from external forces, but from the limitations within ourselves, the moments when our love, no matter how profound, falls just short of the faith required to sustain miracles. It speaks to the terrible truth that we can be our own worst enemies in matters of the heart, that doubt can be more destructive than any external obstacle. There is something magnificent in Orpheus's willingness to challenge death itself, something heartbreaking in his failure to trust completely in the miracle he had earned, something eternal in the music that emerged from his perfect despair. In the Golden Age, when gods walked more freely among mortals, and the boundaries between divine and human experience were as permeable as morning mist, there lived a goddess whose very existence was the embodiment of love in all its forms. When she walked through the world, flowers bloomed more vibrantly, birds sang more sweetly, and mortals found themselves capable of emotions more intense and pure than anything they had experienced before. She was the goddess who blessed marriages and inspired poets. Yet for all her power over the hearts of others, Aphrodite's own heart had remained remarkably untouched by the forces she commanded. She had taken lovers among gods and mortals alike, had inspired countless tales of passion and romance, but had never herself experienced the kind of love that transforms the lover as much as the beloved, the kind of devotion that makes one willing to sacrifice everything for another's happiness. When she first saw him, he was still a child, beautiful even then in a way that suggested he would grow into something that might rival the gods themselves in physical perfection. He had been born from tragedy, the result of his mother's transformation into a myrrh tree. She entrusted him to Persephone for safekeeping during the months when she had duties elsewhere, never imagining that this simple act of compassion would eventually become the source of the greatest pain she would ever know. As Adonis grew from child to youth to young man, his beauty became legendary even among the gods. His face held the kind of perfection that artists spend lifetimes trying to capture. His body moved with the grace of someone completely at home in the physical world. His voice carried tones that seemed to harmonize with the music of the spheres themselves. But more than his physical beauty, there was something in his spirit that drew others to him, a kind of innocent joy in existence that made everyone around him feel more alive, more capable of happiness. It was perhaps inevitable that Aphrodite, watching over his development with the pride of a mother and the appreciation of a connoisseur of beauty, would find her feelings beginning to shift into something more complex and dangerous. The moment when maternal affection transformed into something deeper came gradually, then all at once, like the slow sunrise that suddenly floods the world with light. She began to find excuses to spend more time in his presence, to involve herself more directly in his education and development. What had begun as the care of a guardian became the attention of someone who was falling deeply, helplessly, in love with her own ward. The irony was not lost on her that she, who had caused so many others to experience the madness of unexpected passion, was now discovering firsthand what it felt like to have one's entire existence reorganized around another person's presence in the world. Adonis, for his part, seemed to reciprocate her feelings, though there was always something in his response that felt slightly different from the devotion she inspired in others. Perhaps it was because he had known her since childhood, had seen her in moments when she was simply Aphrodite, rather than the goddess of love. He loved her, but he loved her as an equal, as a companion, as someone whose happiness mattered to him as much as his own. Their time together took on the quality of an eternal spring, filled with laughter and discovery, with the kind of conversations that seem to stop time and make the rest of the world fade into insignificance. They walked through gardens where the flowers competed to reflect their beauty, swam in streams that seemed to sparkle more brightly when they were together. But Adonis had been born not just with beauty, but with the restless spirit of someone who needed to test himself against the world, to prove his worth through deeds rather than simply accepting the worship that his appearance inspired. He was drawn to the hunt, to the dangerous joy of pursuing wild beasts through forests where death waited behind every tree, where courage was measured, not in words, but in the willingness to face creatures that could tear a man apart without effort. Aphrodite, understanding his need, but terrified by it, tried to dissuade him from the more dangerous aspects of his chosen pursuit. She spoke to him of the beauty of peaceful meadows, of the joy to be found in gardens where no violence was necessary, of the satisfaction of creating rather than destroying. But she could not bring herself to forbid him, outright recognizing that to do so would be to change the very thing about him that she loved most: his independence, his courage, his refusal to be defined by others' expectations. Instead, she contented herself with warnings, with protective charms, with bargains struck with other gods to ensure his safety during his expeditions. She armed him with weapons blessed by the gods, surrounded him with companions chosen for their loyalty and skill, mapped out for him the territories where he would be safest. Every precaution that divine power could provide, she provided, telling herself that love combined with wisdom could surely protect what was most precious to her. The day that would end their happiness began like any other, with Adonis preparing for a hunt while Aphrodite hovered nearby, torn between her desire to keep him safe and her knowledge that he needed to be free to pursue his own path. They had quarreled the night before, not seriously, but with the kind of tension that comes when two people love each other so much that the thought of loss becomes almost unbearable. She had pleaded with him to avoid the deeper parts of the forest, where the most dangerous beasts made their homes, and he had promised to be careful while making it clear that he would not be restrained by her fears. It was the kind of conversation that lovers have when they are trying to balance care with freedom, protection with respect, and it had ended with kisses and promises and the kind of desperate tenderness that comes when people sense, without being able to name it, that they are running out of time. The boar that would kill Adonis was no ordinary beast, but a creature of supernatural size and ferocity, some said, sent by Ares in jealousy over Aphrodite's affections. Others claimed it was simply the embodiment of all the wildness that civilization tries to tame and control. Whatever its origin, it possessed a malevolence that went beyond animal instinct, a deliberate hostility toward anything beautiful or beloved. When Adonis encountered it in a grove where the sunlight filtered through leaves like scattered gold, he was alone, having outdistanced his companions in the excitement of the chase. The confrontation that followed was brief and decisive, a moment when all of Aphrodite's protections and all of Adonis's skill proved insufficient against the simple fact that some forces in the world exist purely to destroy what others love. The boar's tusks found their mark with the precision of fate itself, opening wounds that no divine healing could close, spilling blood that would transform into flowers but could not be returned to the veins that needed it. Adonis died as he had lived, beautifully, his last breath forming words of love for the goddess, who had tried so desperately to keep him safe. Aphrodite felt his death like a physical blow, the severing of a connection that had become so fundamental to her existence that she had forgotten what it felt like to be complete without it. Her grief was not the quiet sorrow of mortals, but the cosmic anguish of a force of nature, learning what it meant to lose, to be powerless, to discover that even gods must sometimes bow before the finality of ending. She raced to where he lay, her divine speed carrying her across distances that should have taken hours to traverse, but arriving still too late to do anything but hold his cooling body and rage against the indifference of a universe that could allow such beauty to be snuffed out so carelessly. Her tears, falling on his blood, transformed into anemone flowers, creating the first memorial to a love that death had interrupted but could not entirely destroy. The other gods, witnessing her anguish, offered what comfort they could. But Aphrodite had learned something about love that all her previous experience had not taught her, that the deepest affection is also the greatest vulnerability, that to love completely is to give hostages to fortune, to open oneself to a kind of pain that no divine power can prevent or heal. She bargained with Hades and Persephone as Orpheus had done, but her petition was different. She did not ask for Adonis to be returned to life. Perhaps understanding better than the mortal musician had the futility of trying to undo what had been done. Instead, she asked that he be allowed to spend part of each year with her, returning from the underworld during the months when flowers bloom and the world remembers what it means to be beautiful. The arrangement that was granted echoed the one that governed Persephone's own movement between worlds, a recognition that some loves transcend the simple categories of life and death, that some bonds are strong enough to bridge even the gap between existence and non-existence. During the months when Adonis walked again in the world of light, Aphrodite's joy would make all flowers bloom more brightly, all lovers embrace more tenderly, all hearts open more readily to the possibility of connection. But during the months of his absence, when he returned to the shadowy realm where the dead found their rest, Aphrodite's grief would temper her usual encouragement of passion with a deeper understanding of its costs. She became not just the goddess who inspired love, but the one who understood its price, who knew intimately the way that joy and sorrow interweave in every heart that dares to care deeply about another. The story of Aphrodite and Adonis speaks to the democratic nature of love's pain, the way that even the gods themselves are not immune to the fundamental vulnerability that comes with caring more about another's welfare than one's own. It reveals that divine power, for all its scope and magnificence, cannot shield the heart from the basic tragedy of mortality, cannot guarantee that what we love most will be protected from the random violence that stalks all beautiful things. Yet there is something almost comforting in this divine vulnerability, a recognition that the pain of loss is not a punishment inflicted on mortals alone, but a universal experience that connects all conscious beings in a web of shared suffering and shared hope. Aphrodite's tears transforming into flowers become a promise that beauty can emerge, even from the deepest grief, that love, even when it ends in loss, leaves traces in the world that continue to inspire and transform, long after the lovers themselves have passed into memory. As the anemones that grew from her sorrow continue to bloom each spring, marking the return of Adonis to the world of light, we turn toward another tale of love that crossed the boundaries between the natural and the artificial, between the living and the created, between the possible and the impossible. In the ancient city of Cyprus, where artisans gathered from across the known world to perfect their crafts, and where beauty was understood to be not merely ornamental but essential to human flourishing, there lived a sculptor whose skill had transcended the ordinary boundaries of his art. Pygmalion was his name, and those who witnessed his work spoke of it not as mere craftsmanship, but as a form of magic, a way of breathing life into stone that seemed to violate everything anyone understood about the difference between the living and the dead. He had come to sculpture not through accident or tradition, but through a kind of desperate need to create something perfect in a world that seemed increasingly flawed and disappointing. In his youth, he had sought love among the women of his city, but had found in each potential partner some failing that made lasting devotion impossible. Perhaps it was their mortality that troubled him, the way human beauty faded with time and circumstance. Perhaps it was their independence, their insistence on being themselves rather than conforming to his vision of what love should be. Or perhaps it was simply that his artist's eye saw too clearly the gap between the ideal and the real, making him unable to accept anything less than perfection. Whatever the reason, Pygmalion had gradually withdrawn from human society, spending his days and nights in his workshop, surrounded by half-finished statues that seemed to watch him with stone eyes full of mute longing. He worked in marble primarily, finding in its cool perfection a reliability that living flesh could never offer, a permanence that mortal beauty could never achieve. It was during one of these long periods of solitary labor that the idea came to him for the project that would either fulfill all his dreams or drive him to madness. He would create the perfect woman, not to be admired by others, but to be loved by himself. Not as a representation of some distant ideal, but as the embodiment of everything he had ever wanted in a companion, but had never been able to find in life. He began with studies, countless sketches, and small models, exploring different possibilities for beauty, different ways of capturing in stone the essence of femininity itself. But gradually, as the work progressed, the figure that emerged began to transcend his conscious planning, as if the marble itself were guiding his hands toward some vision of perfection that existed beyond his individual imagination. The statue that slowly took shape under his patient chiseling was beautiful in a way that seemed to redefine the very concept of beauty. Her face held an expression of such serene wisdom and gentle compassion that those who glimpsed her in the workshop spoke afterward of feeling that they had been truly seen and understood for the first time in their lives. Her body displayed the kind of perfect proportions that mathematicians spent lifetimes trying to calculate, but animated by a grace that made geometry seem alive. More than her physical perfection, though, there was something in her expression that suggested intelligence, kindness, the capacity for the kind of deep understanding that Pygmalion had sought but never found in his interactions with living women. She seemed to be listening, always listening, as if she were on the verge of speaking, but was waiting for exactly the right moment, the perfect words, the ideal response to whatever was being said to her. As the statue neared completion, Pygmalion found himself spending longer and longer hours in her presence, talking to her as he worked, sharing thoughts and feelings that he had never been able to express to another living soul. He told her about his dreams, his disappointments, his growing certainty that she was the only being who could truly understand him. She seemed to listen with perfect attention, her marble eyes reflecting his words back to him in ways that suggested not merely hearing but genuine comprehension. The day he put the final touches on her lips, carving them with such delicate precision that they seemed ready to part in speech, Pygmalion realized that he had accomplished something unprecedented in the history of art. He had created not just a representation of beauty, but what felt like beauty itself, not just an image of the perfect woman, but what seemed to be perfection made manifest in stone. He named her Galatea, though she herself would never speak the name, and began to treat her not as a work of art, but as a companion. He dressed her in the finest fabrics, adorned her with jewelry worthy of a goddess, arranged her hair with the kind of care usually reserved for a beloved preparing for a special occasion. He spoke to her constantly, telling her about his day, his thoughts, his plans for their future together. Most disturbing of all, he began to believe that she responded to him, that her expression subtly changed depending on what he said to her, that her marble eyes tracked his movement around the room, that her lips curved almost imperceptibly when he said something that pleased her. Whether these responses were real or the product of his increasingly obsessed imagination, even he could not say with certainty. The people of Cyprus, witnessing Pygmalion's transformation from a somewhat eccentric artist into a man who appeared to be conducting a romance with a piece of stone, began to worry about his sanity. Friends visited his workshop, less and less frequently, uncomfortable with the intensity of his devotion to what was, no matter how beautiful, ultimately an inanimate object. Some suggested that he needed to return to the world of the living, to seek companionship among actual women, rather than pouring all his emotional energy into a fantasy that could never truly reciprocate his feelings. But Pygmalion had moved beyond the point where such rational advice could reach him. He had discovered in his relationship with Galatea something that felt more real and more satisfying than any connection he had ever made with a living person. She never disagreed with him, never disappointed him, never revealed flaws that marred her perfection. She was always exactly what he needed her to be, always responsive to his moods, always beautiful in precisely the way that moved him most deeply. The festival of Aphrodite that year fell during a time when Pygmalion's obsession with his creation had reached levels that concerned even those who had grown accustomed to his eccentricities. He spent entire days talking to the statue, entire nights standing guard over her as if she needed protection, entire weeks in a kind of trance-like devotion that seemed to blur the boundaries between reality and delusion. On the day of the festival, however, something compelled him to leave his workshop and join the procession of worshippers making their way to Aphrodite's temple. Perhaps it was the memory of a time when he had believed in the possibility of love between living beings. Or perhaps it was some unconscious recognition that his situation had moved beyond what he could resolve through will or art alone. At the altar of the goddess, surrounded by couples seeking blessings on their relationships and individuals hoping to find love, Pygmalion made a prayer that revealed both the depth of his obsession and the remnant of sanity that recognized its impossibility. He asked not that Galatea come to life. Such a request would have seemed too absurd even to him, but that he might find a woman who was like his beloved statue, someone who possessed her beauty, her apparent wisdom, her perfect responsiveness to his needs. Aphrodite, listening to his prayer, understood what he really wanted in a way that he himself could not consciously acknowledge. She saw in his devotion to an artificial creation a kind of love so pure and so desperate that it transcended the usual boundaries between the possible and the impossible. Here was a man who had loved so completely that he had literally created the object of his affection, who had poured so much of his soul into stone that the stone had become more real to him than reality itself. The goddess's response was not the granting of his explicit request, but the fulfillment of his deeper need. She breathed life into the marble, not changing Galatea's appearance, but transforming her essential nature from stone to flesh, from art to reality, from imagination to living presence. Pygmalion, returning to his workshop, initially noticed nothing different about his beloved statue. She stood where he had left her, beautiful and serene, her expression holding the same perfect blend of wisdom and gentleness that had captivated him from the beginning. It was only when he approached to greet her, as had become his custom, that he realized something fundamental had changed. Her eyes, which had always seemed to track his movement, were now unmistakably alive, following him with an awareness that no marble could possess. Her lips, which she had carved to suggest the possibility of speech, parted slightly, as if she were about to speak. Her chest, which had never moved, now rose and fell with the rhythm of actual breathing. The moment when Pygmalion first touched living flesh where marble had been before, the instant when Galatea's hand reached out to touch his face in return, was perhaps the only time in human history when a love that had been entirely one-sided suddenly became mutual, when a relationship that had existed only in imagination suddenly stepped into reality. Galatea's first words when she finally spoke were his name, pronounced with a voice that was exactly as he had imagined it would be, warm and melodious, and full of the same understanding that her expression had always seemed to promise. She was everything he had created her to be, but now she was also herself, possessed of her own thoughts and feelings and desires, no longer merely the reflection of his vision, but a genuine person capable of choosing to love him in return. Their marriage was celebrated throughout Cyprus as a miracle, a demonstration that the gods still took interest in mortal affairs. The true devotion could indeed work wonders that defied all reasonable expectation. Pygmalion and Galatea became symbols of perfect love, proof that artistic vision combined with genuine passion could transcend the limitations that normally bound human experience. Yet even as their story seems to end in triumph, it carries within it questions that echo forward through all the tales of love that follow. What does it mean to love someone who exists only as you have created them to be? Can genuine affection develop between two people when one has literally been designed to please the other? Is there something beautiful or something deeply troubling about a devotion so complete that it requires the transformation of the impossible into the possible to find fulfillment? Galatea, in coming to life, brought with her not just the perfection that Pygmalion had carved into her form, but also the independence that comes with genuine consciousness, the capacity to grow and change and become something other than what her creator had originally envisioned. Their love story, which had begun with absolute control on one side and absolute compliance on the other, now had to evolve into something more complex and reciprocal, something that could accommodate to genuine wills rather than one will and its perfect reflection. The questions raised by their union reverberate through time, touching on issues that seem particularly relevant in ages when technology makes the creation of artificial companions increasingly possible. When the line between the real and the simulated grows ever thinner, they remind us that love at its deepest levels requires not just beauty or compliance, but the kind of mystery and independence that can only exist between two genuine persons, each capable of surprise growth and the choice to love in return. As we leave Pygmalion and Galatea to work out the complexities of their miraculous union, we turn toward a love story that was defined not by the possibility of perfect control, but by the impossibility of bridging the gap between two worlds. A tale of devotion that was tested not by the question of whether love could create life, but by whether it could survive the barriers that geography and fate place between yearning hearts. In the ancient world, when the sea was both highway and barrier, both the path to adventure and the grave of ambitions, too bold for mortal undertaking, there lived two young people whose love would become legendary, not for its consummation, but for its tragic persistence in the face of insurmountable obstacles. Their names were Hero and Leander, and their story unfolds across the waters of the Hellespont, that narrow strait that separates Europe from Asia, to worlds divided by a distance that seems negligible on any map, but proved infinite in the geography of the heart. Hero was a priestess of Aphrodite, dedicated to serving the goddess of love in a temple that stood on a high tower overlooking the sea from the European side of the strait. She had been chosen for this sacred role, not only for her beauty, which was legendary throughout the region, but for her apparent detachment from the very passion that her goddess embodied. Her dedication to the temple was seen as proof that she could serve love without being consumed by it, could tend the sacred flame without being burned by desires of her own. The tower where she lived and worked rose from the coastline like a finger pointing toward the heavens, its beacon visible to ships passing through the treacherous waters below. From her windows, Hero could see across the narrow channel to the Asian shore, where the city of Abydos spread along the waterfront, its buildings catching the light of sunset in ways that made the foreign land seem both tantalizingly close and impossibly distant. It was during the festival of Adonis, when people from both sides of the strait gathered to honor the beloved of Aphrodite, that Hero first encountered the young man who would transform her life from one of serene dedication into a story of desperate longing. Leander had come from Abydos with a group of friends drawn more by the promise of celebration than by any particular devotion to the gods. His heart still unattached, his future seemingly as open and limitless as the sea itself. The moment their eyes met across the crowded temple, both felt the kind of instantaneous recognition that poets describe, but most people experience only in dreams. It was not merely physical attraction, though both possessed the kind of beauty that artists spend lifetimes trying to capture. It was something deeper and more mysterious, a sense that they had been incomplete without knowing it, that they had been waiting their entire lives for this exact moment of discovery. The festival lasted 3 days, and during that time, Hero and Leander found ways to be near each other that did not violate the sacred protocols that governed her position. They spoke in the formal language required between a priestess and a worshipper, but their eyes carried on a different conversation entirely, one that spoke of recognition, longing, and the growing certainty that they had found in each other something that neither had known they were seeking. When the festival ended and Leander was forced to return to Abydos with his companions, both felt the separation like a physical wound. The narrow strait that had always seemed like a minor inconvenience now revealed itself as an almost unbridgeable chasm, a barrier that transformed what should have been a simple courtship into an epic challenge. But love, as they were about to discover, has its own geography, one that recognizes no boundaries save those imposed by death itself. During the long nights that followed, as Hero tended her sacred flame and Leander paced the shores of Abydos, they began to develop a plan that was both brilliantly simple and terrifyingly dangerous. Each night, when darkness fell and the waters of the strait were hidden from the view of casual observers, Hero would light a special beacon in her tower, a flame brighter than the usual navigation light, visible from the Asian shore to anyone who knew to look for it. And each night, Leander would slip away from the city, make his way to a secluded beach, and begin the swim that would carry him across the treacherous waters to his beloved's arms. The swim itself was no casual undertaking. The Hellespont was notorious among sailors for its unpredictable currents, its sudden storms, its tendency to humble even the most experienced mariners. The distance, while not great for a ship, represented a formidable challenge for a swimmer, especially one who had to navigate by a single point of light while fighting currents that could easily carry him far off course. Yet love gave Leander strength beyond his natural abilities, transformed him from an ordinary young man into something approaching a mythical hero. Night after night, he entered the cold water and struck out across the channel, guided by Hero's beacon, sustained by the knowledge that each stroke brought him closer to the arms of the woman who had become the center of his universe. The hours they spent together in Hero's tower stolen from the darkness between midnight and dawn, were filled with a philly intensity of connection that seemed to compress lifetimes of affection into brief interludes of perfect happiness. They spoke in whispers, as if loud voices might break the spell that allowed their impossible courtship to continue. They held each other with the desperate tenderness of people who know that every embrace might be their last, that every kiss must carry the weight of all the kisses they might never share. As the seasons turned and their nightly meetings continued, both Hero and Leander began to show the strain of sustaining a love that existed only in the stolen hours between darkness and dawn. Hero found it increasingly difficult to maintain her composure during the day, to perform her sacred duties with the serenity that was expected of Aphrodite's priestess. Her fellow servants began to notice changes in her behavior. Her tendency to stare across the water toward Abydos, her obvious exhaustion despite her apparent lack of daytime activities. Leander, for his part, became known in his city as a young man who seemed to sleepwalk through his days, present in body but absent in spirit, as if his true life existed somewhere else entirely. His friends noticed his increasing isolation, his reluctance to participate in the social activities that had once given him pleasure. But the physical demands of his nightly swims were beginning to take their toll as well. The cold water, the powerful currents, the constant strain of fighting his way across and then back again. All of this was gradually wearing down even his love-enhanced endurance. There were nights when he barely made it to Hero's tower, arriving exhausted and chilled to the bone. But when she suggested that they find some other way to be together, some solution that did not require him to risk his life on a nightly basis, Leander refused to consider alternatives. The swim had become more than a means to an end for him, a way of proving to himself and to the gods that his love was strong enough to overcome any obstacle. As autumn gave way to winter, the conditions for swimming became increasingly treacherous. There were nights when Hero, watching from her tower, could barely make out Leander's form in the churning water below. When she held her breath until she saw him emerge safely from the waves, the other priestesses in the temple, noting Hero's obvious distress during the winter months, began to ask questions that she found increasingly difficult to answer. But she could not reveal the true nature of her situation without destroying both her position and Leander's safety. It was during one of the most violent storms of the winter, on a night when any reasonable person would have remained safely indoors, that the inevitable tragedy finally occurred. The wind was howling across the strait with a fury that seemed personally vindictive. She stood at her window, beacon blazing behind her, silently pleading with Leander to recognize the impossibility of the conditions, to choose safety over devotion, to remain on his side of the water until the storm passed. Between reasonable prudence and the kind of love that refuses to recognize limitations, he had missed too many nights recently due to weather, had spent too many hours lying awake knowing that Hero was waiting for him, wondering if his absence meant that his courage was finally failing. The decision, when he made it, was not based on any rational assessment of his chances of survival. That true devotion sometimes demands risks that no sensible person would take. He entered the water as he had so many times before, but this time the sea seemed determined to claim him as payment for all the previous crossings it had allowed. The waves that closed over his head were larger and more powerful than anything he had encountered before. Somewhere in the middle of the strait, with the storm raging around him and his strength finally beginning to fail, Leander must have realized that this time his love was not going to be enough to carry him to safety. Perhaps in those final moments, as the water closed over him for the last time, he found that had ever mattered to him that his last conscious thought was of Hera waiting for him in her tower. Hera, watching from her window through the long night, gradually came to understand that the beacon she tended was no longer a signal but a memorial that the light that had guided her, beloved to her arms, was now illuminating only empty water. The choice between a life that had lost its meaning and the kind of ending that makes a statement about the nature of true devotion. The leap from her tower was not an act of despair, but a declaration, a final proof that some loves are indeed stronger than death, that the heart, when it has found its true match, cannot survive the loss of what gave it purpose. Her body, found beside Leander's, among the rocks where the sea had claimed them both, completed a love story that had been written not in words but in the patient repetition of impossible journeys across dark water. Their tale echoes forward through time as a reminder that some kinds of love exist not to be consummated but to be tested, not to find fulfillment, but to discover how much the human heart can endure in service of its deepest attachments. Hero and Leander loved each other, not because it was easy or safe or reasonable, but because they had found in each other something that made all other considerations seem trivial by comparison. The beacon that Hero lit each night continues to burn in the imagination of anyone who has ever loved across impossible distances, who has ever felt the pull of connection that transcends geography, circumstance, and common sense. Their story speaks to the democratic nature of true devotion, the way that love, when it reaches its deepest expression, transforms ordinary people into heroes willing to attempt the impossible. As their story fades into the mist that eternally rises from the waters where they found both love and death, we turn toward another tale of affection that could not find its proper object. Another story of hearts that yearned across unbridgeable gaps, though this time the barriers were not geographic, but rooted in the very nature of identity itself. In the deep forests, where sunlight filtered through layers of leaves to create patterns of light and shadow that seemed to shift and dance with their own inner life, there once dwelt beings whose existence was so intertwined with the natural world that they seemed less like separate creatures than like manifestations of the forest's own consciousness. Among these nymphs and spirits lived one whose voice had been transformed by divine punishment into something both more and less than it had been before. Echo had once possessed the full power of speech, had been known throughout the woodland realm for her wit and eloquence, her ability to engage in the kind of conversation that made hours pass like minutes and left her companions feeling as if they had touched something profound and nourishing. But she had used her gift of language in ways that ultimately brought divine displeasure, had employed her silver tongue to distract and deceive, to cover for the romantic adventures of her fellow nymphs by spinning elaborate tales that kept suspicious gods occupied while lovers met in secret. The punishment that befell her was precisely calibrated to address her particular sin. She retained her beautiful voice but lost the ability to initiate. Speech condemned to repeat only the final words of others, to echo rather than originate. To participate in conversation only as a reflection of what had already been said. It was a curse that transformed her from a full participant in the social world into a kind of living mirror, capable of responding but never of beginning, of reflecting but never of creating. In the beginning, this limitation seemed manageable, even poetic in its own way. Echo learned to choose carefully which words she repeated, to make her echoes into a kind of art form that could convey meaning even within the narrow constraints of her curse. But as time passed, she began to understand the true cruelty of her situation. She could no longer express her own thoughts, her own feelings, her own desires, except through the accidental appropriateness of others' words. It was while she existed in this state of beautiful limitation that she first encountered the young man who would become both the focus of her deepest longing and the source of her ultimate destruction. Narcissus was his name, and he moved through the world like a living work of art, so beautiful that his mere presence seemed to argue for the existence of divine perfection, so perfectly formed that artists who glimpsed him spoke afterward of having seen the template from which all human beauty was derived. But Narcissus carried within his perfect form a fatal flaw that mirrored Echo's own limitation in ways that neither of them initially understood. Where she could only respond to others' words, he could only respond to his own reflection, so completely absorbed in his own beauty that he seemed incapable of truly seeing anyone else, of recognizing that others possessed interior lives as rich and complex as his own. Echo first saw him while he was hunting in her forest, moving through the dappled light with the unconscious grace of someone who had never had to consider the effect of his appearance on others. She was immediately struck not just by his physical beauty, which was indeed extraordinary, but by something in his manner that suggested a deep loneliness, a sense that he was searching for something that he could not name or identify. Following him through the woods at a distance, listening to him speak to his hunting companions, Echo began to fall in love, not just with his appearance, but with the sound of his voice, with the occasional moments when his conversation revealed glimpses of intelligence and sensitivity. Beneath his obvious self-absorption, she began to collect his words like precious gems, treasuring the phrases she could repeat, hoarding the sentences that allowed her to feel, however briefly, as if she were participating in genuine communication with him. Finding himself alone in an unfamiliar grove, he called out, his voice carrying clearly through the trees, seeking some response that would guide him back to his friends. "Is anyone there?" Felt her heart race as she realized that she could finally speak to him, could finally make her presence known, even if only through the limitation of her curse. "There," she repeated, her voice carrying from the trees like the sound of his own words returning to him from some mysterious source. Narcissus, puzzled but intrigued, called out again, "Come out and show yourself, show yourself." Echo replied, and in those two words managed to convey not just the repetition required by her curse, but her own desperate desire to do exactly what he asked, to emerge from hiding and reveal herself to the object of her devotion. The conversation that followed was perhaps the strangest courtship in all of mythology, a dialogue between two people who could not truly communicate, but who nevertheless managed to circle around the edges of understanding through the accidental poetry of echo and response. Narcissus, gradually realizing that someone was indeed present in the forest with him, began to move toward the source of the voice, while Echo, emboldened by his apparent interest, began to emerge from her hiding place among the trees. When they finally stood face to face in the clearing, both felt the shock of recognition, though what each recognized was different. Narcissus saw a nymph of extraordinary beauty, her form graceful and ethereal, her eyes holding depths that suggested intelligence and passion. But more than her appearance, he was struck by the way she seemed to understand him. The way her responses to his words seemed to capture perfectly the essence of what he was trying to communicate. Echo, seeing him clearly for the first time, felt her love deepen beyond anything she had experienced while watching him from afar. His beauty was indeed remarkable, but it was the vulnerability she glimpsed in his expression, the confusion and longing that he tried to hide beneath his perfect exterior, that truly captured her heart. She approached him with arms outstretched, ready to offer the embrace that would transform their strange conversation into genuine connection. But Narcissus, confronted with the reality of another person's desire for him, recoiled in a way that revealed the true depth of his inability to connect with anyone outside himself. "Keep away from me," he cried, his voice harsh with a panic that surprised them both. "I would rather die than let you touch me." "Touch me," Echo repeated, but the words that had been meant as rejection became, in her voice, a plea that hung in the air between them, like a bridge he could not bring himself to cross. Narcissus fled from the clearing, leaving Echo alone with the echo of his rejection reverberating through the forest, transforming her curse from a limitation on her speech into a prison for her heart. She had finally found someone she could love completely, someone whose words she treasured enough to repeat. But he had proven incapable of accepting the love she offered, unable to see past his own reflection to the reality of her devotion, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to think of anything but the young man who had rejected her so completely. She began to waste away until nothing remained of her but her voice, still calling out through the forest, still repeating the words of others, still hoping against all reason that Narcissus might return and recognize what he had lost. But Narcissus, having fled from Echo's love, had found himself confronting an even more destructive form of obsession, one that would prove to be both the fulfillment and the destruction of his deepest nature. Seeking water to quench his thirst, after his flight through the forest, he had come upon a pool of perfect clarity, its surface so still and reflective that it seemed less like water than like a window into another world. When he knelt beside the pool to drink, the face that looked back at him from the water was here at last, was someone whose beauty matched his own, whose gaze held the same intensity he felt, whose lips seemed to promise the kind of perfect understanding he had never found with any living person. The irony of his situation was perfect and terrible. He who had rejected Echo's love because he could not see past his own beauty had now fallen in love with that very beauty, but in a form that could never be possessed, never be touched, never be anything more than a reflection that disappeared the moment he disturbed the water's surface. Day after day, Narcissus lay beside the pool, gazing at the face that gazed back at him with equal intensity, reaching toward lips that seemed to reach toward his, speaking words of love to someone who mouthed the same words back to him but could never respond with his own voice. He was trapped in a relationship that was simultaneously the most perfect and the most impossible love affair in the history of the world. Like Echo, he began to waste away, but where her fading was caused by the pain of rejected love, his was caused by the impossibility of consummated love. He could not touch what he loved, could not possess what he desired, could not even be certain that the beautiful youth in the water was anything more than an illusion created by light and surface tension. As he grew weaker, spending his days in futile attempts to embrace his own reflection, Narcissus began to understand the true nature of his predicament. "Alas," he whispered to the face in the water, "you are myself, and I am you, but we can never be together. Be together, came Echo's voice from the trees around the pool, her disembodied presence still following him, still repeating his words, still offering the love he had rejected while he pursued the love he could never have. In his final moments, as life ebbed away from his beautiful form, Narcissus reached one last time toward the water, trying to touch the lips that had tormented him with their perfect inaccessibility. But even in death, the curse that had bound him to his own reflection would not be broken. His body, falling forward into the pool, disappeared beneath. Echo, witnessing his death from her invisible perch among the trees, felt her own long-delayed ending finally arrive. Her voice, which had lingered in the forest long after her body had faded away, finally grew silent, leaving behind only the natural phenomenon that bears her name. The way sound returns to us from distant surfaces, changed but recognizable, a reminder of words once spoken but never fully heard, creating situations where love becomes impossible, not because of external obstacles, but because of the very nature of the lovers themselves. Echo, capable of love, but unable to express it fully, and Narcissus, capable of inspiring love, but unable to receive it, represent complementary forms of isolation that make genuine intimacy impossible. Their tale asks uncomfortable questions about the nature of self-love and other love. Narcissus' inability to love anyone whose beauty did not mirror his own speaks to a kind of emotional limitation that makes all genuine relationships impossible, while Echo's curse represents the way that some people lose themselves so completely in their love. For others, that they cease to exist as independent persons. Echo's voice, continuing to call out long after her body had faded, and Narcissus's flower, forever gazing at its own reflection, become symbols of the persistence of love, even in the face of absolute impossibility. As their story fades into the silence that follows all echoes, we turn toward a tale of love that began with the kind of mutual devotion that Echo and Narcissus could never achieve, but that transformed over time into something far darker and more destructive than simple, unrequited passion. In the ancient kingdom of Colchis, where the boundaries between the civilized world and the realm of magic were as thin as the veils that separated mortal perception from divine reality, there lived a woman whose power over the hidden forces of nature was matched only by the intensity of her capacity for both love and hatred. Medea was her name, and she was known throughout the region not only as a sorceress of extraordinary ability, but as a princess whose intelligence and strength made her a formidable ally and a dangerous enemy. She had been born into a family where magic was not an art to be learned, but a birthright to be wielded, where the ability to transform reality through will and knowledge was considered as natural as breathing. Her father, King Aeetes, possessed powers that made mortals tremble and gods take notice, while her aunt, Circe, was legendary for her ability to transform men into beasts, to reveal through magic the true nature that lay hidden beneath civilized exteriors. From childhood, Medea had displayed an aptitude for the mystical arts that surpassed even her impressive lineage, demonstrating not only the raw power inherited from her bloodline, but an intuitive understanding of the deeper principles that governed the relationship between the seen and unseen worlds. She could brew potions that healed mortal wounds or caused immortal sleep, could speak with animals and plants, could read the future in the patterns of wind and water. But more than her magical abilities, those who knew her spoke of her as someone who had never learned to feel anything by halves, who approached every relationship and every conflict with the kind of totality that most people reserved for the most crucial moments of their lives. It was this combination of power and passion that would make her both the salvation and the destruction of the man who arrived in Colchis seeking the golden fleece, that legendary treasure whose acquisition would restore his rightful place in a world that had rejected him. Jason came to her father's kingdom not as a suitor, but as a hero on a quest, accompanied by the greatest adventurers of his generation. Men whose names would echo through history as symbols of courage and excellence. The quest for the Golden Fleece was not simply a matter of acquiring a valuable object, but a test that would prove Jason's worthiness to reclaim the throne that had been stolen from his family. The fleece itself was guarded by a dragon that never slept, protected by trials that had killed every previous hero who had attempted to claim it, surrounded by obstacles that seemed designed to ensure that only someone possessing both divine favor and supernatural assistance could hope to succeed. When Jason first appeared at King Ite's court to request permission to attempt the trials, Medea felt something shift in her understanding of the world, as if the arrival of this stranger had revealed possibilities that she had never before imagined. He was not the most handsome man she had ever seen, nor the most obviously heroic, but there was something in his manner that suggested depths of character that went beyond surface appearances. Perhaps it was his willingness to undertake an apparently impossible quest, or perhaps it was the way he spoke of his mission, not as a desire for personal glory, but as a duty to restore justice to his homeland. Whatever the source of her attraction, Medea found herself drawn to Jason in ways that surprised her with their intensity. Feeling for the first time in her life the kind of love that poets conscribed, but that she had never believed she would experience personally. The trials that King Itis set for Jason were designed to be impossible, tests that would allow the king to maintain his reputation for fairness, while ensuring that the Golden Fleece remained safely in his possession. Jason would have to yoke fire-breathing bulls, plow a field with them, plant dragons' teeth that would spring up as armed warriors, and defeat those warriors before they could destroy him. Even if he succeeded in these tasks, he would still have to face the sleepless dragon that guarded the fleece itself. Watching from the palace as Jason prepared to face these trials, knowing that he was walking toward almost certain death, Medea felt her heart torn between loyalty to her family and devotion to a man she barely knew but already loved more than her own life. The conflict between these allegiances was not merely personal but cosmic, representing the clash between old loyalties and new possibilities, between the safety of the known and the dangerous promise of the unknown. The decision she made in that moment of crisis would define not only her own fate, but the fate of everyone she would ever love or hate for the rest of her life. She chose Jason not simply as a romantic partner, but as the focus of a devotion so complete that it required her to betray everything she had previously held sacred, to turn her back on family, country, and the very gods who had given her power, who sprang from the dragon's teeth potions that would put the sleepless dragon into the first sleep it had known since the beginning of time. But more than practical assistance, she offered him something that no other person in his life had ever provided: absolute loyalty, unconditional support, the kind of love that was willing to sacrifice everything for the beloved's success. She asked nothing in return, except that he take her with him when he left Colchis, that he make her a part of the life he would build with the golden fleece as the foundation of his restored kingdom. The night that Jason succeeded in claiming the fleece, with Medea's help transforming the impossible into the merely difficult, they fled Colchis together under cover of darkness, stealing away like lovers in a romantic tale, rather than like the fugitive criminals they had technically become. Behind them, they left a kingdom in chaos, a king betrayed by his own daughter, a family torn apart by the conflicting claims of love and loyalty. The journey back to Jason's homeland should have been the beginning of their happiness together, the start of a life built on shared triumph over impossible odds. Instead, it became the first indication that the love they shared carried within it the seeds of its own destruction, that the very intensity that had made their initial connection so powerful would eventually transform it into something twisted and dangerous. The first sign of the darkness to come occurred when they were pursued by Medea's brother Absyrtus, sent by their father to bring back both the fleece and the daughter who had stolen it. Rather than face capture and separation, Medea made a choice that revealed the true depths of her capacity for ruthless action. She killed her own brother, cutting his body into pieces and scattering them in the sea, knowing that their father would have to stop his pursuit to gather the remains for proper burial. Jason, witnessing this act of calculated brutality, began to understand that the woman he had fallen in love with was capable of things that went beyond his experience or imagination. The magic that had seemed so wondrous when it was being used to help him achieve his goals now revealed its darker potential. Its capacity to transform love into something that recognized no moral boundaries, no limits on what could be justified in the name of devotion. Yet their love survived even this revelation, perhaps because Jason needed Medea's power as much as he desired her affection. Perhaps because he had already committed himself so completely to their shared future that he could not afford to question the methods that had made it possible. They married in a ceremony that was both celebration and alliance, the joining of a hero and a sorceress whose combined abilities seemed capable of overcoming any obstacle the world might place in their path. For a time, their marriage appeared to fulfill all the promises that their dramatic courtship had suggested. Medea used her abilities to help Jason establish himself in his homeland, to overcome the remaining obstacles to his assumption of power, to create the kind of life they had dreamed of during their flight from Colchis. She bore him children who seemed to inherit the best qualities of both parents, who carried within them the potential for both heroic achievement and mystical power. But Jason, having achieved the goals that had originally motivated his quest, began to discover that success brought with it new ambitions, new desires, new possibilities that had not been visible from the perspective of an exile seeking to reclaim his birthright. The kingdom he had won with Medea's help was not the end of his story, but the beginning of a larger narrative, one that might require different alliances, different forms of support, different kinds of marriage than the passionate union that had carried him through his heroic phase. When the opportunity arose to marry Glauce, the daughter of King Creon of Corinth, Jason began to see the advantages of an alliance that would expand his power and influence in ways that his marriage to Medea, for all its personal satisfactions, could not achieve. Glauce was young, beautiful, and politically connected, representing the kind of respectable union that could establish Jason as a legitimate ruler rather than merely a successful adventurer. The decision to abandon Medea in favor of this new marriage was presented by Jason as a matter of political necessity rather than personal preference. a strategic choice that would benefit not only himself but their children, who would have access to opportunities that their current situation could not provide. He spoke of his continuing affection for Medea, his gratitude for everything she had done to help him, his hope that she would understand the logic of his decision and accept it with the grace befitting a woman of her intelligence and power. But Jason had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the woman he was attempting to dismiss so casually. Medea was not someone who could be set aside like a tool that had outlived its usefulness, was not capable of accepting betrayal with philosophical resignation, was not willing to smile and step gracefully into the shadows to make room for a more politically advantageous wife. The love that had driven her to betray her own family, to murder her own brother, to sacrifice everything she had ever known for the sake of one man's ambition, did not simply evaporate when that man decided he no longer needed her services. Instead, it began to transform into something darker and more dangerous, a force that would prove just as capable of destruction as it had once been of creation. Medea's response to Jason's betrayal was not the grief of a woman who had lost her beloved, but the fury of a sorceress who had been played for a fool, who had given everything and received nothing in return except dismissal and abandonment. The magic that she had once used to create possibilities began to focus on a single goal: revenge that would be so complete, so devastating, that Jason would spend the rest of his life regretting the day he had decided that Medea's love was something he could afford to lose. The vengeance she planned was not a simple matter of personal retaliation, but a work of art in its precision and cruelty, designed to destroy not just Jason, but everything he valued, everyone he loved, every hope he harbored for future happiness. She began with Glauce, the innocent young woman whose only crime was being chosen as Medea's replacement, sending her a wedding dress and crown that had been soaked in poisons that would burn their wearer alive, while appearing to be the most beautiful garments ever created. When Glauce donned the cursed gifts, they adhered to her skin like living flames, burning her with a fire that could not be extinguished, killing her in agony, while her father, attempting to save her, was consumed by the same magical flames that had claimed his daughter. The palace that should have celebrated Jason's new marriage instead became a funeral pyre for the innocents who had become entangled in the web of his ambition and Medea's rage. But even this spectacular revenge was not sufficient to satisfy the depth of Medea's anger, was not proportionate to the magnitude of the betrayal she had suffered. Jason still had their children, still had hope for the future, still retained the possibility of finding happiness elsewhere with someone else. As long as any part of his life remained intact, as long as any possibility of joy remained to him, Medea's work would be incomplete. The final act of her revenge was the most terrible because it required her to destroy what she herself loved most in order to inflict the greatest possible pain on the man who had rejected her. Her children with Jason, the innocent products of their love, became the instruments through which she would deliver the ultimate punishment, the final proof that some betrayals create consequences that go beyond anything the betrayer could have imagined. Standing over the sleeping forms of her own children, dagger in hand, Medea faced the most horrific choice that any parent could confront: the choice between her love for them and her need for revenge, between mercy and justice, between creation and destruction. The internal battle that raged within her was as epic as any war fought between nations, as decisive as any conflict that had ever shaped the course of history. In the end, revenge won, but not without cost to the avenger herself. As she killed her own children, Medea understood that she was destroying not just Jason's hope for the future, but her own as well, that in her quest to make him pay for his betrayal, she was paying a price that would bankrupt her own soul. Yet she continued, driven by a logic of pain that recognized no limits, no boundaries, no considerations, except the imperative to make betrayal as costly as possible. When Jason arrived to find his children dead by their mother's hand, his new wife and father-in-law consumed by magical fire, his world reduced to ashes by forces he had never fully understood, he confronted the true cost of treating love as a negotiable commodity. Medea, appearing before him in a chariot drawn by dragons holding the bodies of their dead children, represented the return of everything he had tried to escape, the final accounting for all the debts he had thought he could avoid paying. Again, no peace or happiness or the possibility of love without the shadow of what he had lost. Then she disappeared into the sky, leaving behind only destruction and the terrible knowledge that some kinds of love, when betrayed, become indistinguishable from the most perfect hatred. About the ways that intense love can become a form of ownership that refuses to accept loss or change. Yet there is something magnificent even in Medea's terrible revenge, something that speaks to the cosmic injustice of a world where those who love most deeply are often those who suffer most profoundly. Her transformation from devoted wife to avenging fury represents not just personal pathology, but a kind of mythic justice, a reminder that actions have consequences, that betrayal creates debts that must eventually be paid. As her dragon-drawn chariot disappears into the clouds, carrying her away from the ruins of everything she had once loved, we are left with the knowledge that love, at its deepest levels, is not an emotion that can be safely contained or easily controlled. Now, as we approach the end of our journey through these landscapes of the heart, we find ourselves confronting the question that runs like a dark river through all these tales. What is it about love that makes it so often indistinguishable from tragedy, so frequently bound up with loss and suffering, and the kind of pain that reshapes the very foundations of existence? Perhaps the answer lies not in the particular circumstances of any individual story, but two forces larger and more unpredictable than individual will or desire. To love completely is to give hostages to fortune, to open oneself to possibilities for both joy and anguish that go beyond anything the unloved heart can imagine. The Greeks understood this better than we do, perhaps because they lived in a world where the boundaries between the human and divine were more permeable. Their myths speak to eternal truths about the human condition, truths that remain valid regardless of the particular cultural moment in which they are encountered. In the story of Hades and Persephone, we see how love can require compromise, how the deepest affections sometimes demand that we accept division rather than unity, presence rather than possession. Their tale reminds us that some relationships can only exist in the spaces between certainty and doubt, that the most profound connections sometimes require us to accept loss as the price of connection. Orpheus and Eurydice show us how love can inspire attempts to reshape reality itself, how devotion can drive us to challenge the fundamental laws of existence, and how our own limitations can become the instruments of our greatest tragedies. Their story speaks to the terrible truth that we can be our own worst enemies in matters of the heart, that doubt can be more destructive than any external obstacle. Aphrodite and Adonis teach us that even divine power cannot shield the heart from the pain of loss. Their tale reveals that the capacity for suffering is not a weakness, but an inevitable consequence of the capacity for deep affection. That grief is the price we pay for having had something worth grieving for. Pygmalion and Galatea explore the strange territory between love and creation, between devotion and control, asking uncomfortable questions about what it means to love someone who exists primarily as we have shaped them to be. Their story touches on issues that seem particularly relevant in ages when the artificial begins to approximate the real, when the boundaries between the created and the born become increasingly difficult to distinguish. Hero and Leander remind us that some loves exist not to be easily consummated, but to be tested, that true devotion sometimes requires the willingness to attempt the impossible on a regular basis. Their tale speaks to the way that physical separation can become a metaphor for all the obstacles that stand between hearts and their desires, and how the attempt to overcome those obstacles can become more important than success itself. Echo and Narcissus show us how our deepest needs and greatest limitations often mirror each other, creating situations where love becomes impossible, not because of external barriers, but because of the very nature of the lovers themselves. About the ways that our relationships with ourselves affect our ability to connect genuinely with others. Finally, Medea and Jason demonstrate how love, when betrayed, can transform itself into something that recognizes no moral boundaries, no limits on what can be justified in the name of wounded devotion. Their tale serves as a warning about the consequences of treating affection as a negotiable commodity, about the debts that betrayal creates and the interest that accumulates on unpaid emotional obligations. Taken together, these stories form a kind of map of the heart's darker territories, a guide to the regions where love intersects with loss, where devotion encounters destruction, where the highest human aspirations meet the deepest human limitations. They remind us that the mythology of ancient Greece was not primarily concerned with providing comfortable moral lessons or reassuring examples of virtue rewarded, but with exploring the full range of human experience in all its beauty and terror. These tales continue to resonate across millennia because they speak to experiences that remain constant despite all the surface changes in human civilization. We still fall in love across impossible distances, still find ourselves drawn to people who cannot or will not return our affection, still discover that our capacity for creation and our capacity for destruction often spring from the same source. The darkness in these stories is not a flaw to be explained away, but an essential element that gives them their power to illuminate truths that brighter tales cannot reach. Not a safe harbor, but a dangerous ocean, not a solution to the problems of existence, but a magnificent complication that makes life both more difficult and more worthwhile. In the end, perhaps the most important lesson these myths teach us is that love in its deepest and truest forms is not something that happens to us, but something we choose to embrace, despite full knowledge of its potential costs. Happiness, but because they were willing to love completely, even when they understood that such love might destroy them. Their stories echo forward through time as reminders that some things are worth the risk of total loss, that some connections justify the acceptance of ultimate vulnerability, that some forms of devotion transcend the simple calculus of pleasure and pain, that governs most human decision-making. As we emerge from these tales, like travelers returning from a journey through strange and dangerous lands, we carry with us not easy answers, but better questions, not simple solutions, but deeper appreciation for the complexity of the human heart. The myths of Greece offer us not escape from the difficulties of love, but tools for understanding those difficulties more clearly. Not promises that affection will always lead to happiness, but assurance that it will always lead to transformation. In the quiet hours, when we find ourselves confronting our own capacity for both creation and destruction, our own hunger for connection, and our own fear of loss, these ancient stories continue to whisper their truths about what it means to be human, to love, to lose, and to discover that sometimes the greatest tragedies are also the most beautiful testimonies to the power of the heart to transcend its own limitations. The darkness in these tales is not the darkness of despair, but the darkness of depth, not the absence of light, but the recognition that some truths can only be seen by those willing to venture into the shadows where love and loss dance, their eternal dance, where beauty and terror embrace like lovers who have found in each other the perfect mirror of their own deepest natures. And so these stories end as they began, with whispers in the darkness, with questions that have no easy answers, with the recognition that love at its deepest levels remains as mysterious and dangerous today as it was when the first human heart opened itself to the possibility of caring more about another's welfare than its own survival. In that continuing mystery, in that persistent danger, in that endless capacity for both creation and destruction, we find not the solution to love's riddles, but their eternal, beautiful, terrible confirmation.